Hello, everybody. Hope you're doing fine. Hope you're surviving the COP so far here in day 3, which is always a bit painful. Thanks for coming to this very interesting session where we're going to be talking about food transitions, finance, and job creation, amongst many other things. And we have a raving panel for you today, whom I'm going to introduce in just a moment. And we will be going on for like roughly 1 hour and 15 minutes. And we will be having some opening statements by the panelists. Then we will have a discussion, and there will also be time for Q&A from the audience. And then we will have some closing remarks, and then we'll all go out and have a solution to shifting the food system, hopefully. So let me first start by setting the scene a little bit. The onset from this conversation is here that we have a broken and fragile food system. We're seeing that right now we are facing a polycrisis. That is becoming a big buzzword now. It has been for many years, but particularly this year, polycrisis in terms of species extinction, hunger, climate change, and so forth. And a lot of these things are very closely aligned or influenced by the way we produce our food today. And in the context of climate change mitigation, adaptation, as well as resilience, this has become a really hot potato this year and will probably also be next year. And a good example is where we're sitting right now. We're sitting in the MENA region in Egypt, one of the most drought-ridden regions in the world, where there's huge problems with food production that lead to an undernutrition, due to people being unable to get proper food for their children. And a lot of the food is imported, and that has been exacerbated by the recent crises. We're seeing not just the climate crisis, but also very much the wars we're seeing, particularly the war in Ukraine, as Egypt and the MENA region generally is very reliant on imports on different commodities, particularly wheat and sunflower oil. So I think everybody is in agreement we need to shift the food system to something that is much better than what we have now, and that entails a just transition. The problem is that there's not really no global approach to doing it. Everybody have different approaches, which could be good if they're aligned, but that is often not the case. And I wanted to draw a little parallel to just transition within energy production. For those that have been following that debate for many years, particularly since Sharon Burrow made the infamous words of "there are no jobs on a dead planet," just transition has become a key guiding for both climate change mitigation within global stocktake and so forth. It's the kind of call to everything in terms of mitigating climate change from an energy perspective. And it used to be easier to address that than it is now when it comes to food systems. For instance, if I used to be able, when I worked on energy, to talk about if you get $1 million and invest that in fossil fuels, you create 7 jobs. If you invested in renewable energy, you create 14 jobs. They're better jobs, they're safer, they're more gender equitable, and so forth. But here's the thing, there's an estimated 50 to 60 million people working in energy production around the world. There is at least 1.2 to 1.3 billion people working in food systems. And they're very, very different. Everything from big industrialized systems to smallholders, pastoralists around the world. So how do we create a just transition with the diversity and the enormity of the transition we have to do, particularly when it comes to job creation? And that also leads us to, as we transition, where does the funding comes from? Because right now, very little funding is actually going into transitioning food systems in the right way. I'm just going to get the numbers right here. Food systems, they only receive about $9.3 billion in terms of mitigation work. That's less than 3% of the global budget for mitigating climate change, which is completely disproportionate to the importance and the emissions issues you're seeing with the food system. So where does the funding come from in terms of shifting the food system? What is the role of national banks, regional banks, multilateral development banks? We have some people here from those today. And what is the role of the private sector in making things change quickly? So today we're going to talk a little bit about the challenges and the opportunities there are for creating a better world and mitigating climate change and dealing with the adaptation and resilience issues we're seeing, and at the same time as moving towards feeding the world and dealing with undernutrition, particularly in least developed countries. So with that, I'm just going to take you over and introduce our speakers. I'm not going to talk through your bios because we are running a little bit late and people tend to not like that anyway, but you can just Google their names and a lot of good stuff is going to come up. These are some of the leaders in the movement that are creating real change and helping to shift the food system to something that is much better for consumers and for farmers, nature, and for the climate. So to my far left, I guess it is, we have Graham Watkins, who's the Chief of Climate Change at the Inter-American Development Bank. Welcome. Next to him, we have Suzanne Gaboury, who's the Director General of Private Sector Operations Department at the Asian Development Bank. And next to her, we have Ismael Sunga, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Southern African Confederation of Agricultural Unions, the SACAU. And next to him, we have Gadagnini, who's the Managing Director in Brazil of the Good Food Institute. And just next to me here, within reach, if she says something wrong, we have Helena Wright, who is the Policy Director of the FAIRR initiative. So welcome and thanks a lot for being here. So the way we're going to do things now, we're going to give each panelist 2 minutes to just do some opening remarks on the issue we're discussing today, and then we're going to come into a discussion. So I'm going to go back to you, Graham, and invite you to talk for 2 minutes.
Hello, this works? Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Hope it was okay getting here. Running around, COP is sort of everybody's favorite pastime now. I'll start off just talking about what the problem is, or the way that we see the problem. And very, very quickly, I mean, food production basically emits methane and nitrous oxide. Food production causes deforestation. But in addition, once you convert something to food production, that means you can't use that land area for regeneration. So you can't actually reforest that area because it's already being used. As a result of those, for those reasons, and talking about targets and investment targets and things like that, we actually have a target within the Inter-American Development Bank that 10% of the operations that we consider to be climate finance need to be land use based. We're probably over time going to be increasing that as we move forward to be able to drive more funds towards this issue. Because frankly, it's the #1 issue for Latin America and the Caribbean. It's the biggest driver of issues in Latin America and the Caribbean, of emissions. Just some data on that. Beef, and we recently published a paper on this, beef causes about 2/3 of the deforestation, 2/3 of the GHG emissions that arise from food, but it only delivers 4% of the calories, and it only delivers 12% of the protein in the area. But it's complicated because beef is also essential for households. Many people depend on beef production. 50% of rural households actually are connected to beef. So that means it's going to be very difficult to drive transitions and ensure that they're just transitions. In addition, at a more national level, so 46% of the added value that occurs in agriculture is in beef. And it's growing at about 4% every year in Latin America. And it's also an important export for many countries. So this is quite a complex set of circumstances that need to be addressed. So from our perspective, and I'm talking more from the public side, not from the private side, governments really have to overcome several really big challenges. The first is, how do you work to improve the farming practices, the supply side? How can you actually make the supply side work, make it sustainable? But I think that they're also going to have to work on the demand side. They're actually going to think about things like changing food production and diets. And this is something that's been discussed quite substantially if you do look for sort of net zero type plans for better nutrition, but also in order to be able to reduce the impact of agriculture. But you're going to have to do that in a context where you're going to have to move against social and cultural norms. And I just want to put that all on the plate right up front, because that's how complicated this particular problem is. And then we can talk more about it as we move forward. So I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, Graham. And yeah, the complication grows. Suzanne, over to you.
Thanks very much. You know, I'll look at it from a slightly different perspective, more from the finance side. And so, you know, part of our role is to direct finance towards mitigation and adaptation. As we know, in the private sector side, adaptation is a bit more of a challenge in order to do that. So within ADB, agribusiness, agriculture is a primary pillar of what we do. And as we're directing more financing toward that, and it's critical for climate. We know, you know, given some of the numbers that you've put out, the needs as well as the demands on our environment with that. So we need to come up with some solutions for that. And at the same time, you know, part of our discussions at COP here, it's all about climate, but agribusiness, agriculture is an essential part of that. So we need to figure out and enable to create the decarbonization pathways. As you're talking about that, it's land, it's water use, it's climate risk, it's all those things above where we need to create opportunities and solutions for that. By far, the majority of food is grown by smallholder farmers who are the most impacted and probably least equipped to deal with all of these. And I think for us, we're looking at that aspect. A lot of our finance goes towards smallholder farmers, but we're also trying to ensure that the supply chains for food are continue to move. And given the external environment from, you know, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with inflation, rising energy prices, these are all impacting this. So we'll have to work together in partners to find solutions for that.
Thanks a lot, Suzanne. Ismael?
Thank you very much. Am I loud and clear? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I try. Let me keep on at that level. I'm talking primarily from the producer side, from the farmer side. And the key question that I've been asked to address are the obstacles to a just transition from a farmer's perspective. And I just want to spotlight about 5 key areas. The first one really is the issue that most farmers are residing in areas where there is basically no backbone infrastructure. There are no roads, there are no clinics, no social amenities, no water, no energy, no electricity, no everything. And just transition and just financing, we have to address that. I think that's the first point. The second point really is that farmers essentially bear most of the risk and get very little return out of the entire chain, and also have limited access to affordable financing. So when we're talking about just financing, we need to look at that. How do we make sure that whatever financing is available is going to address the issue of the power imbalances within the chain, as well as the distribution of risk and reward amongst all the different value chain actors. Number 3, the issue of human capital stock. We know that most of the farmers, at least the smallholder farmers, are fairly aging, and we really need to replace the capital stock. And I believe that we need to have a new generation of farmers. And I believe that for effective transformational agriculture to happen, we shall need to have financing that is promoting and facilitating the entry of a new generation of farmers. The last but one point really is that farmers really play a significant role in terms of managing the ecosystems, and yet they don't get sufficient return or reward out of it, if anything. So I believe that directing financing towards that is going to be very important in terms of improving their incomes and improving their livelihoods. The last point really is about risk and exposure to climate risk, to market risk. And I believe that if financing is going to be directed at that, it will actually contribute towards the just that we want in the transition. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ismael. Gustavo?
Thank you. I'm Gustavo from the Good Food Institute, Brazil. GFI works in new alternatives for people to eat their protein. And as Mr. Watkins from IDB described it very well, when we think about the problems of agriculture today, beef is central to these problems. when we think about food systems, all these matters that are being raised about food systems, more than 2/3 of these problems are caused by animal production. And he covered very well the environmental data about this, but we also need to remember that there are more layers from this problem. One of them is the farming of new pandemic diseases. So now we are seeing in the media, I read this yesterday night, that some countries are living a triple infection from COVID, pig flu, and influenza. And this is another big concern that we are living. So these diseases that are contaminating the world and changing everything, they are coming from the animal production. And also the antibiotic resistance and so many other layers of this situation. Besides of this, to produce this food that is being unable to feed the world, we are now destroying everything in our environment. So we are not able to produce food for more than 800 million people on the world, and we are destroying the planet in our resources to produce this. One of the central points is exactly the fact that the calories that I get from beef are very inefficient. If you eat meat, for each 1 calorie that you get from meat, at least 10 calories were given to the animal during its life. And when we think about a problem that is so big, it goes to hungry, it touches environmental protection, human health, animal cause, people are aware of this. So why people are not just eating something differently from that? And there is another layer. So there it goes beyond the importance of beef in our economy, but it's the importance of food in our culture. People don't want to just let go from everything that is their culture and their traditions that are related to food. When we go and think about Christmas in the United States, there is turkey. Turkey is on the table. When we think about Brazil, we can't think about Brazil without talking about barbecue and how much barbecue is a part of our culture. And people just don't want to eat zucchinis in their barbecue. They want to eat meat. People in the United States, they don't want to grill a vegetable in their grill. They want to grill their burgers. That's the tradition, the recipes that they learn from their families. So alternative protein is a solution of how we can deliver the same foods that people are already used to eat, allowing people to keep their habits and their traditions, but changing the way the food is produced so we can create food in a more sustainable way. You like burgers, you like grilling burgers with your family, you learned this from your parents, so you keep this tradition. But this burger that will taste the same, will look the same, will have the same texture, this burger will be made from vegetables. So that's the idea. We work with 3 technologies that are plant-based foods, fermentation, proteins, and also cultivated meat. That is this new science of creating food directly from cells. And the idea is to provide a much more sustainable way of people of eating what they already love. In the center of our theory of change is the fact that no matter how much we make advertising to try to change people's habits, they will keep hanging to the families, the traditions, the things that they learned during their entire life. Brazilians will keep eating barbecue. So we need to find new forms of delivering this barbecue in a much more sustainable way. That's how GFI works.
Thank you so much, Gustavo. And I feel sorry for the zucchinis, but over to you, Helena.
Hi, thanks. So I'm Helena Wright. I'm the policy director at FAIRR. I'm going to give a slightly different perspective, which is coming from what the finance community and investors are focusing on in food system in terms of food system risk. FAIRR is a 69 trillion investor network focused on sustainable food systems, launched 5 years ago. And since then, we've seen a huge increase in the number of investors interested in the risks and opportunities related to the food system. So including climate, biodiversity, working conditions, and antibiotics. And those investors are trying to engage with the companies in the food chain to bring about a more sustainable food system. So, I mean, as Lasse mentioned, we've actually only just started really thinking about the just transition in relation to agriculture. It hasn't really been talked about and it hasn't been on the agenda until this COP, I think. The vital importance of just transition is that workers must not be left behind, and that's the principle of it, in the transition that we need to a more sustainable food system in line with the planetary boundaries. And we've seen growing interest in this, for example, investors with 16 trillion have supported a engagement with companies on working conditions, so trying to improve the working conditions within the food supply chain. And some of the policy recommendations from our recent paper on this topic of just transition were that we need to see just transition funds, as we have seen for the energy sector, but we need those in the agricultural sector. And that will be quite important and vital in terms of repurposing the harmful agricultural support that we see at the moment, which a lot of the public support to agriculture we know is quite harmful. It goes primarily towards intensive animal agriculture and other sectors that were not sustainable. And those subsidies can actually be repurposed to a more sustainable food system. We have the choice to do that. And some of the technologies which would be useful and which investors are looking at are agroecological production, regenerative agriculture, and also diversification into alternative and plant-based protein production. And those new technologies are, obviously there's no silver bullet, but there's a multiple range of different technologies which now the private sector are starting to invest in. We've seen, for example, 3 million of venture investments into plant-based alternatives. And there was a report actually by the ILO, I think in collaboration with the IDB, that looked at Latin America, and they found that actually the transition to net zero could create 19 million new jobs. So that's a huge job creation opportunity for governments as well. So I just wanted to quickly capture 3 lessons which came from the coal sector in China, where there was a just transition investment by the World Bank that helped coal miners to actually transition to more sustainable ways of production. And some of those lessons from energy sector could be useful for agriculture too. One was continuous dialogue and consultation with the workers. So that's vital, and that would be with farmers as well. Temporary income support for workers that are actually losing their jobs, and also programs for re-employment into new sustainable industries. And I think that those lessons could actually be relevant for this as well. And we have $500 billion in unsustainable agricultural subsidies globally. So if we repurpose those, I think we can agree that we can create a more sustainable food system that isn't actually creating stranded assets. And one last point to make is we have increasing consumer demand around the world for more sustainable food products. And we've seen that for plant-based, and we've also seen that for organic food. So the demand is there from consumers. We just need the policies and the subsidies and the development finance to be realigned with supporting a more sustainable food system and avoiding the risky stranded assets. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, stranded assets is going to be one of the big things, right? And for those who are not privy to that information, like most farmers, particularly livestock farmers, have massive investments, millions of dollars in equipment, in harvest machines, in animal equipment, in antibiotics, and they're bought into long-term loans. And it's so easy for us just to go and say, why don't you just shift to something else when they've invested 20 years ahead in time for the operation, and they just need to produce whatever they produce on a daily basis to be able to not, go bankrupt. So it seems that there are some common denominators here. It seems that, we need to shift away from industrialized animal agriculture. We need to have a shift to more just food system. And there are different solutions. There are technical solutions like alternative protein. If you look at the livestock issue, there's also like smallholder technical solutions that are, I know, being invested in these days a lot, whether it's drip irrigation, whether it's specific new crops. And then there is, of course, the aspect of making the differentiation between the overproduction, overconsumption in the global north and the underproduction and then undernutrition in the least developed countries. So what do you think would be a best way forward to bring together some of those different tendencies? So can we have a food system in which we are empowering smallholders around the world, shifting much more towards decentralization, agroecology, and slowly phasing out the worst production system in the global north while including farmers in the process? If you wanted to do that, where should the money come from? And I'm looking at Graham and Suzanne now. If either you want to come in and say, where do we start that process? And where do you see your respective institutions benchmarking against other institutions like the World Bank, IMF, EBRD, and so forth?
Hello? Oh, yeah. I actually see lots of, with what we were saying, each of the panelists. So I don't know if that's by design or it's just an accident, but I think there is a way forward for this. And I also like conceptually the idea of saying, okay, we spent all this time talking about energy systems and just transition and energy systems. What have we learned from that? And then what can we transfer back across? So our suggestion would be that one of the things you need to do, and again, I'm talking from a public sector side, is work with the countries to actually design these strategies to deal with this complex problem. And we've done this in, I think, 4 countries so far. So we've done full on long-term strategies that look at how do you decarbonize the country, but we've also included land use in that process. That means you actually need to ask the questions about what are those supply and demand changes that need to happen. You need to explore those changes. You need to involve the food industry as much as you can. But before you do that, you're going to have to persuade them that this is a good idea and there's a good reason to get involved in that. You can quantify the costs and benefits of the changes and look at who they affect most. So you can actually identify who the winners, the losers are. Once you've identified the winners and losers, you can work with them to actually mitigate the impacts, particularly if the losers are the most vulnerable people. And that's kind of the model that has been applied for dealing with this kind of issue in energy systems as well. And then finally, you actually need to involve the farmers, the actual affected people, in the process of designing the measures as you move forward. But you need those plans to be able to advance the agenda. At least that's what we believe. That's one area of work. I think we've already mentioned this, but I think we also need to very much focus, if we're talking about just transition, on improving the working conditions for agricultural workers and farmers today and as we move forward. This means looking at issues like social protection mechanisms. Can we actually make sure that they're protected as we move forward? Improving risk management, I think this was mentioned also. Not just climate risk management, but also sorts of risk management in agricultural processes. Address occupational health and safety issues. This has been studied quite a lot, but things like heat stress, long working hours are very serious in the case of agricultural workers. Work with both the workers and the companies to actually develop and implement the rules. Because again, if you leave out stakeholders in the process, it's not going to happen. And make sure you can integrate, and I think this was mentioned already, integrate the smallholders into value chains, into structured value chains, so that you can actually have broader impact. What can we do? Coming to your specific question, what can MDBs do? We can help with that complex planning process. And this is something that we're actually offering through technical assistance to support countries to do that. We can also do kind of model projects. The reality is that we can't cover all of the projects in a country, but what we can do is do model projects that then can be scaled out and other groups can do them. For example, in forest management, integrated silviculture practices, agroecology, we're already doing those kinds of projects. We can also provide model finance for agriculture, thinking about incorporating nature positive investments, nature positive elements into agricultural projects. We can build out bioeconomy options, and we have a substantial program now, for example, for the Amazon that we're actually moving forward right now, so that you can actually make other values out of land use, as well as agricultural values. And then one last point that I would make is that one of the successes with energy is that the connection was actually made between doing that work and ministries of finance. Ministries of finance have to be involved in this process. If it sticks with ministries of agriculture, ministries of environment, it's probably not going to happen. But if ministries of finance get involved, they're the real decision makers in a country, then the agenda can move forward. And I'll stop there. I think it's telling me to stop.
That was not on purpose, Graham. Sorry about that. Suzanne, did you want to come in on this point as well? And maybe also if you wanted to touch base on some of the social risks in terms of the transition and maybe the role of also private banks.
No, thank you. you know, one of the things that you're just kind of echoing a little bit of what's been said is that, you know, ADB has both public and private under one roof. So obviously I'm responsible for the private side, but at the same time, we work very closely with our public sector colleagues because you need to influence the upstream, the policy changes, and to make sure that you create the right opportunities for the private sector and make things investable downstream. And I think from the social side, obviously you need to take all the various issues into consideration, which is something where you need to have a development continuum. You need to have a coordinated approach in how to deal with this. And there's different ways of looking at things. There's different ways of financing. And I think with, you know, when you're looking at smallholder farmers, it's really, you know, we know that climate change is really affecting them, and they need to move beyond having volatile and inadequate incomes to something that's more sustainable. So one of the other things that ADB is doing is that, you know, we've are positioning ourselves as the climate bank for the region. So a little bit like you know, just energy transition, just agribusiness transition. You know, last year at COP26, we launched the energy transition mechanism where we would take coal assets out of play. And then looking at financing solutions and trying to create incentives, of course, working with the ministries of finance because they hold the purse strings in the countries, but also you need to have that whole buy-in in order to do that. So you don't have stranded assets because that will be the outcome of this. And then when you're looking at from the commercial side, you need to be cognizant of risk because again, you need to be able to be to be able to delineate what those risks are and how you're going to mitigate them. We view that as one of our roles is to be a facilitator on this. We have different forms of and types of capital from concessional to blended to, you know, just one of our response. I think our roles as a development bank is to bring the risk appetite to do that. So you can bring the private sector in, so you can have that financial intermediation across the various sectors, but in particular with agribusiness and agriculture. Food security is a major, major issue right now across the board. And how do we deal with that with the various issues that are going on now? We know that in the coming months, it's going to get worse. And how are we going to address that? I think this is where we all need to come together as partners in this because we can't do it alone.
Thanks a lot, Suzanne. Before I come over to you, Ismael, I just wanted to ask a follow-up question to the two of you, just very briefly. On the finance side, if you do the calculation of the investments now to shift the system to something better, more resilient for the future, more climate change friendly, as opposed to continuing with business as usual and the cleanup costs of that later, then I'm assuming that the pre-investment is marginal compared to the big cleanup down the line. Is that correct?
I think in any approach, if you do it now, it costs less versus the cost of doing, you know, the net present value of what you're doing is better now versus, you know, if you do it in the future. Absolutely. And so this is really, it's really important that, you know, this now this aspect of food and food growth, you know, is part of COP. You know, I was in some discussions recently, and if you look at what the future holds by 2050, you know, we just passed the 8 billion person mark in global population. 2050, they're talking about 9 billion. And we have to grow more food during that period of time, up to that point that we've grown the last 10,000 years. How do we deal with that and deal with those all issues to make it sustainable as well, and that people have good livelihoods and everything else, and we don't destroy the planet along the way? Absolutely. It's a very complex issue.
Thanks, Suzanne. Ismael, I want to come to you, and we talked a lot about now involving farmers and presumably also people in the process lines and anybody who's working specifically to produce food and make sure everybody eats. There seems to be strong willingness to include those in the conversations. Where do you see the best place to start that? Where we failed in the past, and what do we need to do now to ensure that it is not one group talking about what other groups do, but it's a joint conversation?
Thank you for that question. I think fundamentally we need to be conceptually on the same sort of wavelength, all the key stakeholders. I think the first point really is The reason why it is being called just is because there is some injustice that is there. And if we don't frame it in terms of injustices that are there, that could be injustices in terms of access to production factors. It could be injustice towards the sharing of risk and reward. It could be injustice in many dimensions. So just financing has to target those elements. Sometimes we are looking at a transition that might replicate a system that might be green, but with too impoverished farmers. So we need to be very careful. That is not justice in relation to the environment. It is justice in relation to people who are unfairly treated by value chains and by society in general. So let's not be too technical about that. We are trying to move to a better system. It's a better system defined in the eyes of justifying, of bringing more decent livelihoods for people, bringing more dignity, bringing more dignified lives for farmers. I think that element tends to be missing. So when you talk about financing, it is financing in relation to those kind of injustices.
Thanks a lot. Very important. So now we have the perspective of the necessity for finance and the willingness to start those processes and collaborate with the farmers and anybody else in the food production system. Now I wanted to come to Gustavo and Helena and talk a little bit about alternative protein and the role that can play. How can we, unless we all want to eat zucchini going forward, how can we have a shift to more alternative proteins that are healthy, but also take some of the boxes in terms of having decentralized food production systems, food sovereignty, engaging with the farmers and engaging with all the different stakeholders, so we don't do a one-for-one shift from industrialized meat to alternative protein with the same ownership of production. So like, what are the opportunities for alternative protein for just transition? And Helena, I know you did a report quite recently on the issue, if you wanted to touch base on that as well. First to you, Gustavo.
Well, this is a large discussion, but I think it starts exactly where Mr. Ismael was talking about. Many times in our sector and in the environmental activism in general, the environmental activists end up being in opposition of the farmers. And I think there is some injustice in there, in a way that the farmers are seen as villains that are destroying the world. And we just miss the point that the farmers are actually the people producing everything that we eat. And this food that is destroying the world is the food that we eat, right? They are just producing literally every single thing that kept us alive during our entire lives was produced by a farmer. And when I think about alternative protein, so for instance, plant-based protein, plant-based is also produced in farms, right? Plants come from farms. So one of the things that I think is more important is to start to rethink the subsidies in agriculture in a way that today the government money comes to the producers to cover holes of business that are failing. So when we think about milk producers in Brazil, for instance, they are not rich people profiting billions of dollars from the government money. It's just the opposite of that. Most of the producers are poor and they need government subsidies, they need government money to stay alive, to not starve themselves even when they are on farms. And the bad part about this is that the business somehow is failing. So we give them money and then next year the business is failing more and we need to put more money. And this is an endless cycle that is not creating renovation and is not creating new sources of revenue for these farmers. I think that one of the most important steps that we have ahead is to understand how we can create subsidies for change, how we can attack this money, make this money available for the farmers that need, but also make this money a tool for transformation. I don't think that we need to subsidize the whole production system forever, but we do need to subsidize a gap of change. The moment that the farmers need to invest in their technology, invest in more sustainable production, invest in alternative protein, and for a few years they will be investing without profiting. And we know that they just don't have money for that. So when I think about where the subsidies need to go, it starts on the farmers, and it starts on seeing the farmers as the allies that we need to build the new production chains of the future. When I think about a farmer, a milker farmer, going back to that example, if you have an animal farm, you could just plant oats in your farm and sell plant-based and sell these materials to the plant-based milk industry as well. So many of the companies that work with animals in Brazil, such as JBS, Grupo Mantiqueira, they are now investing in alternative protein as a way of making their business more resilient. If the consumer wants to buy one kind of products, the animal products that they sell, it's okay, they already sell these products, but the consumers now need to buy something that is more sustainable, that is healthier, they are also going to sell these products. And this makes their business much more resilient. If we think about this example and apply this to farmers, I think that we could use alternative protein to create new sources of revenues for these farmers and make their business much more resilient. If we have a disease, an animal disease that kills their cattle, they still have a plant production that is feeding the plant protein industry. And this will be better for society, better for environment, and certainly better for all the climate goals that we need to achieve. We, as GFI, have a very interesting project funding research also on the Amazon flares. I want to talk about this later, but I see there are many interesting projects going in this direction, bringing money to fund the change, understand which are the new technologies of the future, and helping everyone from the food production chain to adapt to these new technologies without leaving anyone behind.
Thanks a lot, Gustavo. A lot of really important points there. And maybe, Helena, if you wanted to, in addition to what you want to say already, also touch about a little bit of the risk mitigation management when it comes to modulation and in terms of finance, and how FAIRR is looking into that as well.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Can you hear me? Yeah, so I mean, I just wanted to make a couple of important points about the role of blended finance, which we've touched on before. But I mean, I was on a panel this morning actually where it was pointed out that only 3% of climate finance has actually gone to agriculture so far. So the sector of agriculture has been sort of broadly left out of the climate finance debate so far. But even though it contributes to 30% of emissions, is one of the most vulnerable sectors to the impacts of climate change as well. But we're beginning to see the recognition of food systems in agriculture. And one project that we're working on at the moment is under Good Food Finance Network. So the co-investment platform that group are looking at in terms of blended finance instruments. And part of the role of that would be for just transition in agriculture. I think I wanted to raise one of the tricky conversations for governments now. And we know that the private sector started to look at this conversation of like sustainable diets, mainly because there's a lot of consumer demand for those products. But actually for governments, governments haven't really looked at this sector sufficiently, even though there is a kind of growing demand for certain products. So that's also a parallel, I would say, with the energy sector, because probably about 10 to 15 years ago, no governments really wanted to talk about shifting fossil fuel subsidies. And now finally, we're starting to have that conversation. So I think there's a bit of a parallel. It takes a long time to have these conversations. And so I just wanted to touch on one other important point, which is around biodiversity risk, which is just coming up the investor agenda. We're seeing more and more people concerned about the collapse of ecosystems. And those ecosystem services support our water supplies. They support our clean air. Like if the Amazon does reach a tipping point, we're going to be in serious trouble with climate change, as we know. So we need to conserve the Amazon. And there was an interesting report out actually just on the topic of diversification into sustainable protein. If we replace just 20% of current global beef consumption, then we could halve deforestation. So that's quite a dramatic figure there that just shows the impact of some of these new sustainable food technology choices. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Helena. This is a really fascinating conversation, and I think we're lucky to have all of you with us today because you bring such a wide variety of perspectives and expertise to it. So I have so many more questions, but I also promised there would be questions from the room, and we also need time for some closing remarks. So I wanted to come to the room now and ask if anybody have any questions for the panel. I see two hands down there. Do we have a roaming mic somewhere? take one of these maybe. Yeah, first. Thanks. And please state your name, affiliation.
Hello. Hi, my name is Mallory. I'm with the American Feed Industry Association. So we represent animal feed manufacturers. And my question, louder, more? Okay, so let me start again. Okay, so my question is, livestock contribute to our food cycle. Livestock eat things that are human food waste or from other processes, other production systems. Those go into livestock feed and livestock eat them. So I was curious if when you're looking at reducing livestock, are there studies being done? What do we do with those food products? And that's a whole kind of another issue of we're creating waste that then is not being utilized. So how does that fit in when you're looking at the reduction of livestock and then what's done with those waste products that are not then being utilized? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So a question about the interlinkage between food waste and animal production and what to do when we phase it out. I think we're going to take one more question. We have the gentleman in the back, then we have the lady over here and the gentleman in the front. But we're just going to take one more now and I'll come back to you too.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. Brendan Kern, I'm a policy fellow at the Grantham Research Institute at the LSE. I'm going to name check our report, which is very linked to this. It's called Just Nature, and it lent a lot on the fantastic work of FAIRR, including their great report, Where's the Beef? So lots of good stuff in there in terms of the role of finance. But what I'd really like to learn a little bit more about is meaningful social dialogue is a critical part of what the ILO defines as a just transition. And I'd really like to hear particularly with a lot of farmers or non-unionized, what are the meaningful mechanisms in which finance can find credibility and that social dialogue is taking place with those farming communities?
Thank you so much. So I'll just stop with these two questions and then we'll come back to the two others here. So maybe the first question on the interlinkage with food waste and animal protein, maybe Gus or Helena would like to talk to that.
I can comment on both questions. Yeah, so about the first question, most of the reports show now is that the animal production system, it is overloaded. So we are relying too much on producing this kind of foods. It's not necessarily that all animals need to be excluded completely from the production chain forever, but that the amount of animals that we have now and that we are producing is being unsustainable, more than contributing to the nature cycle. So when we think about alternative protein, the most aggressive provision that we have comes from consultancy that says that until 2040, alternative protein can be like half of the markets of the total production of the total meat market. So the total meat market will be in 2025, something like $1.2 trillion, and 2040 is expected to be $1.8 trillion. And then if we keep investing in alternative protein, we have the chance of making half of these markets being on a protein diversification. This means that the animals are not going to disappear, even in the most aggressive provision that we have. And the animal production is not even going to become a small kind of production on the short term. So it is possible to keep the animals in the sustainable production chains, but also invest in protein diversification so this system is not that overloaded. And about the second question, I just want to bring very quickly two examples that we have in GFI Brazil. One is the fact that we, as Brazil, produce a lot of beans, but we don't know how to use this bean to alternative protein. We don't have the Brazilian bean isolate protein. We don't know how to apply these beans as ingredients for the alternative protein industry. So we now have a very urgent matter, that is the fact that the science and technology for the sustainable transition is being developed only in the United States and Europe, and we don't have enough funding for other countries to create solutions that adapt to them. GFI Brazil was able to get a small grant from bean producers in Brazil that are now developing these isolates, and we see that there was a lot of food waste regarding this production, where they can't sell the broken bean, like when the grain breaks, they can't sell. but they could sell that to the alternative protein industry to isolate the protein and transform in a even more profitable ingredient for them to sell. So this is just one example of how when you go there and you understand the problems of the communities that are actually making the production, you can change the way they live, and you can change the sustainability of the whole sector. And the other example is that we also got a grant from Climate and Land Use Alliance, Good Energies, and the JBS Fund for the Amazon to promote science with the communities that produce food in the Amazon region and in the Cerrado region. And we are now funding technology, like some communities, for instance, produce the Brazilian nuts, but they don't know how to use this Brazilian nuts as an ingredient. They just sell it to be eaten raw. And they also don't know how to use the whole plants, like the lead, the fibers, and all the ingredients that we could be producing from that. So now we have these partnerships between communities that produce 10 different kinds of plants from the Amazon, and also the academia, like universities that were used to work with these communities, where we are developing and funding the development of new ingredients that are coming from the Amazon forest to feed or to supply for the alternative protein industry. Now these communities have a different source of revenue because they sell the Brazilian nuts, but they also sell the fiber coming from the Brazilian nuts leads, and a number of other ingredients come from the babaçu, the baru, and other plants from Brazil. This is another great example that if we invest in the places where the problem is happening, the communities that live there can create their own solutions, and they are smart enough to invest in the science and technology that is pertinent for that region and to solve the problems where they are happening.
Thanks a lot, Gustavo. Helena, did you want to come in on the question? Maybe Ismael, if you wanted to come in on the second question afterwards about involving farmers.
Yeah, I would just touch on maybe the first question about animal feed. I think it's important to look at where animal feed comes from and obviously the sourcing of that. And as we know, about 80% of soy globally is used for animal feed. I think it's around 20% of corn. So those crops, you know, could be fed to humans, or, you know, actually we could diversify the supply chain there and use their land in different ways, including feeding more people as well. And there's a similar problem with biofuel. So the conflict between animal feed, human feed, and biofuel is another really serious problem. So this is also a food security problem. So I'd say not all of animal feed is using waste. A lot of it we can reuse in different ways if we diversify the supply chain. And I think thinking about the kind of circular and regenerative economy in that paper on just nature transition was also a really good one, that if we look at kind of what aligns with planetary boundaries and how can we create circular economy, I think that would be the way forward. In terms of engaging farmers, yeah, I might pass over to Ismael.
Thank you. I still also want, and they're clapping for me. I still also want to talk to the question about livestock, diversifying away from livestock. I think we need to be very careful about generalizations. There are some areas, perhaps Southern Africa or Africa, where the livestock densities are still fairly low, and the animal protein intake is still fairly low. It needs to be upped. And yet there are other areas in the world where it's very high. So let's not really generalize everything and then apply one size fits all. So I think I just want to caution around that, because that may actually lead to disaster in the end. In terms of consultation, I think we really need a consultation that is based on values of fairness, equity, and transparency, because unless we negotiate and talk around, honestly, that there's something that actually is at fault here that delivers poverty on the one hand of the value chain and opulence on the other. If we don't sort it out, we cannot transition without transformation. We need to transform the livelihoods of farmers through better alignment of sharing equally the resources and the outcomes of the production values. So I think it's important that whatever mechanism is going to use, principles of fairness, equity, and openness have to be enshrined. Unless if we have a system that has got conscience, the current system does not have conscience as far as we are concerned, we are not going to be able to crack it. We will replicate in a socially unsustainable system. which ultimately won't be environmentally sustainable anyway.
Thank you, Ismael. I think the differentiation between the geographies is so important. And the latest IPCC report did point out that there is a linkage between overconsumption of animal protein in the global north, in G20 countries particularly, and undernutrition in least developed countries. So there's a big conversation. And to your point, like when nobody here is think that there should be a decrease of animal protein consumption in the Horn of Africa, that would be ludicrous. So the importance is to focus on where the biggest problems are, which particularly are G7, G8 countries, and to some extent G20 countries. I wanted to come now to the two other questions, and I think they're going to be the last ones. The lady down here and then the gentleman there.
Hello, Camilla Björkbom, working on food policy at Eurogroup for Animals. Yeah. My name is Camilla Björkbom, and I work at Eurogroup for Animals with food policy. And my question is, it regards everything that you mentioned, like working with farmers, but in particular when it comes to cultivated meat. So I'm going to ask this question to Gustavo, because I know that one of the fears sometimes from farmers when it comes to cultivated meat is that it will be a technology that is captured by big corporates, and that it's not going to be compatible with agroecology or a transition to more regenerative agriculture. So I wonder if you could say something about how you envision cultivated meat within this broader transition, and in particular when it comes to like smaller scale farmers and how they will be able to use this technology. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll just take the question from this gentleman here as well.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Msara Pesanai. I come from Zimbabwe, and I am a monitoring and evaluation specialist who also tracks the SDGs, of which climate change is one of the SDG. For me, I think a just transition to global sustainable food systems is anchored on a just, equitable financing. I repeat, just, equitable financing, a financing mechanism that is responsive to the different contexts within which the players or the human species find itself. You'll appreciate that as continents and as individual institutions, as countries, we are at different levels of development. So our contexts are different. Even the gross domestic, it's also different. So when we look at a financing mechanism that will bring the desired goal, it has to consider those different contexts. And the starting point for me is to carry out a problem analysis on financing to say, what is the status of financing in different contexts? Where are we? What are the challenges? And where do we want to get to? And that will also assist us to come with sustainable interventions. Right. Related to that, we have often heard big institutions making commitments for financing, but the challenge with accessibility, it may be small institutions, small countries, small continent may have difficulties in accessing these funds. Next on that, if they can be accessed or by smallholder farmers, the repayment loans, they're just unsustainable, which then put them out. The last comment is on whether within the sustainable food systems, we have a monitoring and evaluation framework, which also guides us to track progress in terms of the global agenda to say, we have set these targets. Where are we in terms of progress? And also go further to evaluate the policies, to evaluate the programs, to say what lessons are we drawing from what we are doing, and also generate evidence that will be used for better programming in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that question. So equitable financing, and maybe a comment from Suzanne or Graham about how that you see that, and maybe how it relates to other measuring mechanisms in terms of where we're moving global stock take. Would that be an interesting place to do comparisons with the comment there?
One of the things that is very much part of everything that we look at from a financing point of view is to ensure that it is done on a sustainable way, that the parties involved, there isn't no harm, I guess, is part of the approach. But, you know, if you're looking at that from the very beginning of your investment, we also monitor things throughout the life of the investment to make sure that you do achieve your SDGs, so that you do achieve everything from an impact point of view, and that there are no disaffected parties within what you're trying to finance. So that's an intrinsic part of how we look at things and as part of being a sustainable financier.
So really quickly, I mean, all the MDBs have safeguard systems that are intended to make sure that we do no harm. That on one level. But interestingly, in the direction that you're going in, one of the things the MDBs just were announcing in another pavilion is Paris alignment. So how do you align financial flows to deliver what the Paris Agreement says? And it's a very complicated process. We're just beginning to learn how to do it. We've got methodologies. But I was speaking to somebody who's part of the negotiations for Montreal, and they're thinking about something similar for biodiversity. So not just nature positive spending, which is something that you can measure as an input, but then also looking at the question is whether or not you could do something similar to Paris Agreement alignment for biodiversity. And again, it's just an initial discussion, but that should help move things in the right direction, make sure the financing is going in the right direction. I absolutely agree on tracking and monitoring and evaluation. And I think, I'll be honest, I think that's an area where we really need to do a lot more work in terms, particularly with policy changes, looking at the impacts of policy changes and then asking, did that work? Did that not work? What happened? Which is complex because you've got long timelines for doing that. And then on the, where do we want to go on finance? I would also draw your attention to a paper that was just published, launched yesterday, which is the paper by Nick Stern and Ongwei, an expert panel group that looks at, you know, what do we need for financing for climate, and how, where's it going to come from, and how we're going to deal with that? What's the role of the private sector? What are the role of the MDBs? So there is some thinking going on about, you know, how we're going to do the financing, and particularly in that context, how do you finance countries that normally don't get access to the finance, which is one of the biggest questions that's out there. So.
Thank you so much. We are getting close to the end, so I'll ask Gustavo just a very quick reply to the question down here. And then while he does that, the rest of you can start thinking about the final question. There's like a 1 minute, 1 minute only question, which is, what are the biggest opportunities for a just transition within food systems? So first over to you, Gustavo.
So this question about cultivated meat, it makes sense if we don't think about the whole production chain. Today, we have a world where 80% of the land, the agricultural land of the world, is producing less than 20% of the calories being consumed. And this is mostly because this land is being occupied by animals or by the food that is feeding these animals, like the soy in Brazil. And this is creating what we call food deserts, where people don't have the access to fresh vegetables because they can only buy processed foods. If you go to the center of Brazil, it's one of the largest food production places of the world. And many people there don't have the access to fresh vegetables because all the area there is being used to produce soy for the animals or the animals themselves. If cultivated meat changes parts of the markets, for changes parts of the meat markets, we are going to release the area to produce food. We think about like, what are the farmers going to do if they are not producing meat? They are going to produce food for 800 million people that are starving now. You know, human food, zucchini, tomato, back to the zucchini, but there are a lot of changes of the production chain that need to happen. And if we decrease the impact that meat has on occupying the whole production chain, we will release space for farmers to produce other kinds of products like the beans, the zucchinis, and they will keep in business. So the land will not disappear. It will shift from producing animal food to produce human food and feeding the world that is hungry.
Thank you so much, Gustavo. And then over to the little 1 minute and brownie points for 45 seconds.
Okay, I'll try and do it very quickly. So we already mentioned one of the benefits is jobs, 19 million jobs that will come to Latin America if you decarbonize, mainly producing zucchinis. Sorry for that. Second one is we actually did cost benefit analyses of what happens in each of the sectors, including agriculture, for Costa Rica, Peru, and Colombia. The net benefits are 22 billion, 29 billion, and 35 billion in those three countries. It makes economic sense to do it. Third point, the markets are changing, the regulations are changing. You can get sued now in France if you can't show the traceability of your product and you can't show it's not deforesting. You need to get ahead of the game. The game is changing. People need to get ahead of the game. That's actually an opportunity. Second opportunity is actually you need to get ahead of the game on these new kinds of meats, because that's coming and it's going to work just like renewables. It's going to be cheaper. There's so much investment going into it now that it is going to be cheaper. And then the last point is that actually, I think you need to think about resilient farming practices as well. And I did want to end on the resilience side. One of the biggest problems for Central America is that farming is not resilient. As a result, farmers get hit, they have to migrate, and then they cause you a whole number of other problems, particularly in cities. One of the benefits of doing this is that you actually make resilient farming systems, and those farmers don't move after the hurricanes have hit. So,
thank you, Graham. Suzanne.
Okay, there we go. Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure to be here and talk about this issue. And I think that, you know, looking for what is the main opportunity, you know, I'll make it a little bit short and sweet and say that, you know, governments and private sector players, we absolutely need to work together on the, you know, on the same value chain in various countries, in a country where they play different roles. I think the governments focus on infrastructure and policies, while the private sector produces or focuses on production and distribution. And then everyone has their role to play, but at the same time, it needs to be coherent, it needs to be rational and reasonable.
Thank you so much. Ismael?
I think from a funding perspective, financing perspective, we really need to get an outcome that is talking to at least tripling of the current funding that is going towards adaptation. And I think coupled with that, there needs to be a value-based principle that you cannot profiteer from provisioning of adaptation funding, particularly if it's going to be going to the smallholder sector, because they cannot be expected to be paying back in terms of interest for something that they were not responsible for in the first place. So there needs to be a principle around that. The third point really is that we need to make sure that there are mechanisms put in place to ensure that those commitments that have been made are actually followed through. And that surely, because we cannot live on commitments and no honoring. So we need to be gentlemen in the agreements and honor our commitments. Thank you.
Thank you, Ismael. Gustavo?
Well, my conclusion is that we heard that beef is a large problem of the large parts of the food system problem, and the food system is a large part of the global environmental problem. So we need to invest much more in the new technologies that are diversifying the sources of protein. GFI believes that the world needs to invest at least $10 billion a year to scale these solutions fast enough to tackle the global warming in the speed that we need in the world.
Short and sweet. Thank you. Helena, final word to you.
Yeah, two final points. One on access to finance that was mentioned here. I think we've seen some great projects on energy sector with the development banks working, say, with local banks to get access to solar panels in rural areas. But we need to see those types of funds about access to new technologies and access to finance for local areas, but for sustainable agricultural technologies, to produce food in a more sustainable way in a range of different technologies that we've already discussed. And I think we can also avoid the costly mistakes of technologies which haven't worked in the past and are causing, for example, antibiotic resistance. Again, that's a huge global threat, which we're just seeing emerging. So yeah, I think those would be my two final points, but also the synergy between adaptation and mitigation, I think can be a really big opportunity, because where technology is using a lot less water, we know water security is one of the biggest threats. There isn't a water day here at this COP, but water security, the same as food security, is a huge, massive threat now with the impacts of climate change. We can save water, we can save resources, and have a win-win-win for climate, development, nature, and human health altogether. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Helena. Before I say my closing remarks, when we're done, would love you to just stay for 30 seconds to take a quick picture together up here. Great. So a couple of final points here. So many amazing statistics and numbers have been put up here. And I encourage all of you here and those who are watching online to look up the respective organizations and institutions of the panelists, where you can dig into much more reports and figures and get all the right figures, and also see what reports are there that can underlie everything that's been discussed today. So it seems to me that there's a strong agreement in terms of the necessity for the shift. There's also somewhat an agreement in terms of which way we need to go. I think the next steps is how do we start that process? How do we really get that off the ground? And I think COP27 has been the most food-focused COP so far, and COP28 is bound to be even more so. So maybe we'll have another conversation in a year from now in Dubai and talk a bit more about zucchini as well. So thank you so much for coming today. It's been a pleasure, and please give a round of applause to the panelists.